Welcome to the Why with James Hsu. My guest this time is Noah Weil. Noah is a magistrate judge at the Seattle Municipal Court. He's been an attorney, a public defender, and now a judge. And in this conversation, we're going to explore all the background, all the reasons why Noah entered this profession. The discussion is laid out for lay people like myself who know nothing about the legal system, the justice system in the United States. So don't worry about that. It'll be fairly easy to follow because I've asked Noah to explain everything along the way in terms of the legal language and implications and how things work. So I think this is going to be a very interesting conversation because it blends the why behind Noah and why he chose to become a judge, and also his unique background and where he's coming from and some of the challenges he's had in his family and mentally and various things. It just all comes together in one dialogue. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. So how did you get involved in the system, or how did you become a lawyer in the beginning?
So that's a more complicated question than you might think. I'll start with more recently becoming a lawyer. I got an undergraduate degree, and originally my interest was in therapy. I was going to be a therapist, and I studied that, and I got a BA in applied psychology. And I decided for myself that it was a little too passive for me, that I wanted to take a more active role in things. And so not immediately, but I decided to go to law school eventually. And so I went to Seattle University School of Law, and I graduated, and then I was within the system. Not quite my first job, but my first job that I was excited to do was as a public defender. And so that's how I started, and that's how I got involved in the criminal justice system. I represented people who couldn't afford to hire their own attorneys.
Okay.
And so I saw a lot of criminal action, and I was in the courtroom a lot because public defenders and prosecutors are probably the lawyers that are in the courtroom the most. And so I learned how the criminal system works specifically. Like, I can't do real estate law. I don't have any knowledge about patents or things like that. My knowledge base from the end of law school and my career has been in the criminal system.
You mentioned just now you thought that studying that other thing was a little bit too passive, and you thought, by implication, you think law would be more active fields. Were those expectations met while you were studying your law degree? Or did you have thoughts during the study, this is what I expected, or this is not what I expected?
I would say so. Law school, the way it's taught, I think in most law schools in the country, is the first 2 years are a generalist kind of thing. So they have a class on legal writing, and they have a class on criminal law, and they have a class on civil procedure and contracts and real estate and things like that. And so you take all these classes and you learn, the basics of all the fundamental pillars of the law. And then, at least in my law school, in the third year, you can select electives, and you can do what's called a Rule 9 in Washington. I think every state has their own. But basically, you can be in court as a law student under the supervision of an established attorney. And then that lets you really focus on things you're interested in, or find out what you're not interested in. And that's when I learned in the courtroom, is really how I learned how the law actually works. The law school is a lot of theoretical things and a lot of debates, but once you're in the courtroom and you're working with human beings, I think that's where the rubber meets the road.
Mm-hmm. So that was your expectation, that at the end of this study, that's what would happen, and that would be something that you're a lot more maybe engaged in?
Well, I should be clear that I didn't really have that much thought about how the practice of law would work in law school, because there's just nothing to compare it to, really. So it wasn't, I was committed. Some people that I went to school with decided law school wasn't for them, and they dropped out of their first year, and I fully respect that if they didn't want to go through all 3 years when the job wasn't for them. But I found a resonance with it, with how my mind works, or the subject matter. And so I knew I was going to stick it out. And so once you know you're going to complete it, it's like whether it meets your expectations or not, you're going to find out, because you're going to get through this process.
Right.
My original thought going into law school the hybrid of my interest in therapy and the interest in law was alternative dispute resolution, where you're involved in mediation and arbitration. And so you're kind of, it's a quasi judicial role, but you're basically bringing the parties together and they can have a conversation and try to work things out. And a lot of people I talked to said, first of all, you can't do that right out of law school. You don't have the experience for it. But a lot of people were really cool to it. They thought it was not using all your legal skills as you can, and they suggested more litigation, which was the more active role, not so passive. Mm-hmm. And so I took that to heart. And then again, when I got that position as a public defender, and I was working for a solo attorney before then as a Rule 9, and he was extremely unhappy as an attorney. And so the work was not very consistent, and he would gripe about things a lot, and I knew it just wasn't a good fit, and I didn't want to do what he did. I think he did bankruptcy, if I remember right. And he just didn't like it at all. Mm-hmm. And so then this position for the public defenders opened up. They were looking for Rule 9 attorneys, Rule 9 law students. And I applied, partially because he was so toxic and partially because I was curious about this. And then once I started talking to people and learning that work, it really felt like a good fit for me.
So how long were you a public defender? Like how much time did you spend in that role?
It's a little complicated. And then there's a personal thing with that too, which I think we'll get to at some point. But so I was a Rule 9 for, I would say, 2/3 of my third year of law school. Half to 2/3, it kind of blurs together. But then they hired me after law school, and I was there for about a year. And then they had a budget issue, and me and the other people they hired right out of law school were laid off. And then they brought me back because an attorney was on maternity leave. So I was there for a few months. And then by this time I had started my own practice. When I graduated, the year before me was the worst year for students getting jobs in like legal history until my year when I graduated. And then that was the worst year. And then the year after that, I think they were the worst year after that. And then it kind of tapered off. But a lot of my people I went to school with were like having a lot of trouble finding work. And I was part of that. And so I just decided to open up my own practice. And so I was a solo criminal defense, a private attorney instead of a public attorney. But I really liked public work. I really liked representing indigent people. And so all throughout my career, from when I opened that practice to basically when I closed my practice last year, I was taking what are called conflict cases. And that's when the public defenders have a conflict of interest and they have to get an outside attorney to take a case. And so I was still doing, a part of my practice was always public defense.
What's an example of conflict of interest?
The most common one is when somebody in a case, a witness, is a former client of the public defenders.
Ah, I see.
You can't cross-examine your own clients.
I see.
So they have to have somebody else take on that role.
Okay. Sorry for the interruption. Yeah, I was just
no, that's okay. It's a great question. People would always ask, like when they were appointed to me, they'd say, "What was the conflict?" And they don't tell me, and I just said, most likely somebody in the case was involved with the public defenders in some other way. Sometimes it's because there's some kind of breakdown in communication or personality conflicts. That happens, but the most common thing is just somebody involved used to be a defendant.
Can you give me an idea? This is always hard to ask someone to explain what they've done for years and years, but what is it like to actually represent folks as a public defender? Like, I can imagine someone who's in court for whatever reasons, like they probably, like me, know nothing about the law. I'm sorry if that's a kind of glib statement, but I assume that a lot of people don't know a lot about what they're getting into, and you have to represent their best interests. You have to give them a fair defense. So, I mean, what is that process like communicating with folks? I mean, your clients. Do you have a framework for doing that? Is there a general way or a mindset that has helped you?
I appreciate that question, and I've thought about that a lot, and I think you're the first person to ever ask me that, so I really think that's a fantastic question. Yes, there's a framework. I'm trying to gather my thoughts on how to explain it. And it's funny too, because a lot of what you're asking and what we're going to talk about flows into the judicial stuff, which I'm sure we'll talk about as well. But my clients broke down between private and public, right? I had private people who had means that could hire me at my regular rate. And that was a different framework or experience than people who were indigent and couldn't hire me. And then I was appointed to their cases. Okay. So we'll start with the private ones first. Not always, but more often than not, this was the first time they were involved in the legal system, at least as defendants. They may have had a small claims case, maybe they had a divorce, but anything where they were looking at jail time, this was likely their first time. Okay. And so, yeah, they're terrified, right? They may have been arrested, they might have spent the night in jail. Even if they didn't, they know that that's a possibility. And so my work, we've already had some conversations because they've hired me, right? We've met at my office, we've talked about the case, we've talked about things. And my work is to do a couple things. I want to demystify the process. I don't want them to think, I don't know what's going to happen. So usually a case would have multiple court dates. We'd have the initial court appearance, the first appearance, then there'd be some status hearings, and then there'd be a resolution. It might be a trial, it might be a plea, it might be a dismissal, but there's a process along the way, and it takes a number of months. And so the first thing is making sure they knew every step of the way, like how this works. So often I'd be hired before they had to appear in court for the first time. And so I would tell them, this is what the charges are. This is what this means. When they say you're charged with driving under the influence, which is a very common charge, this is what they're saying. You're operating a motor vehicle, and in the state of Washington, and your blood alcohol content was, 0.10 or something. And so that's what that means. That's what they have to prove. That's all they're alleging. They're not saying you're a bad person. They're not saying, you should never drive again. They're saying on this day, June 1st, 2019, you operate a motor vehicle and you had too much alcohol in your system. Full stop. So that's what we're looking at first. Okay. I wasn't there. I don't know if that's true. I'm just letting you know that's what the accusation is. Okay. So this is a gross misdemeanor. The maximum sentence for this charge is a year in jail and a $5,000 fine. Whatever happens, I don't think we're looking at a year in jail. You don't have any history. There was nobody got hurt in this thing. So, whatever the worst case scenario is, don't think it's going to be like the end of the world. Whatever happens, your life's going to go on. But let's see if we can do better than, the worst case scenario or what's likely. And so, we talk about the big picture stuff. Here's what it's looking like. We talk about the evidence. Usually the evidence kind of comes in trickles, so it's not like I can show them everything right off the bat. But I tell them, I'm going to get police reports, I'm going to get toxicology reports, I'm going to share everything with you. There's not going to be anything hidden, there's not going to be any surprises, so everything that I see, you'll see it too. If you don't want to look at it, that's fine, but you have the option. I don't want you to feel like I'm hiding anything from you. And I tell them it's usually a process because the evidence does come in slowly, and I've got to do witness interviews and things like that it's not going to be done right away. And then, I'm sorry, this is going to be hanging over your head for a few months, and just prepare yourself that we're not going to get this solved next week or in a couple weeks, but you have somebody working on this case. You're not by yourself. You have somebody who knows the system and knows what's going on. You can call me anytime you want. You can email me anytime you want. If you have questions about things, we'll talk about it, right? And so it's just letting them know they have this advocate, that they have somebody who understands what's going on and that won't hide the ball, is available, will share things. And that you can see like that tension releasing. Like it's always going to be there, but just knowing
like setting the expectation and also letting them know that you're on their side. You're working actively to help them.
Yeah, I don't work for the judge. I don't work for the prosecutors. I don't work for the county or the state or anything else. I'm your attorney. And then we talk about what's going to happen in the court dates. And the first court appearance, they're going to formally charge you with a crime, and maybe they'll ask for bail, maybe they won't. I'm going to argue against that. We'll talk about what happens if we succeed. We'll talk about what happens if they succeed. And, I can make like educated guesses. I had done it long enough that I could be pretty good about predicting what would happen. And then usually I was right. And then they would feel more comfortable because I told them what would happen, and that's what happened. And then eventually they'll make an offer on the case. And I think some lawyers do it differently, but I always told them it was their choice. Like I never pressured anybody to take a plea deal. I was like, they're asking for 1 day in jail here. If we go to trial and we lose, you could be looking at a month. If we, win at trial, there's nothing. It's up to you. I'm 100% supportive of whatever you decide. And just tell them the pros and cons. Here's the best parts of their evidence. They have you on video. and you confessed, and also 3 people saw you doing it, and you confessed again for some reason. So their evidence is pretty good. It's pretty good evidence, but you can take the stand and say everybody's lying and the video was edited. We'll see what happens. The juries can do what they will, but that's your choice. That kind of thing.
Is that a common thing? Is that, I mean, what I see in on TV or in perhaps fictionalized reports is that
doesn't always get it right, James.
yeah, like, but I assume like pleas and settling things outside of going full trial is a fairly common outcome to a lot of these things, or it's something at least that your clients tend to take, or you advise them that that it is an option. Like, is that a common thing that happens?
Well, there's a couple answers to your question. I never tell anybody to take a plea deal. I know some lawyers who do, who feel like their clients just aren't sophisticated enough to know.
To clarify, you said, I don't mean to put words in your mouth. Like you said, you give them the palette of what their options are, right? You don't tell them you should do this, but you could do A, B, or C, that kind of thing.
And fundamentally, the criminal process is really disempowering to people, to the defendants. You have to be in court here. We take away your liberty there. And so I feel like my role is to empower them as much as possible, let them know they have autonomy and they have choices. They might not all be happy choices, but no one's taking away the choices that they do have. And I think people appreciate that. So in answer to your question about whether people plead or not, it really depends on the kind of court. We have federal courts, we have felony courts, we have misdemeanor courts in Washington. Every state has a federal court, and every state has their own version of those kinds of courts. So I'm only talking about Washington state. But I would say that the higher the stakes, I think federal courts, there's a lot of pleas, and in felony courts, it's pretty common. In misdemeanor courts, it's also pretty common, but I'd say less common. I think it's like 90% in federal court and like 70% in the state level or the misdemeanor level.
What is the reason for that? For example, it being higher federal courts, is that because of the nature of the cases? Is it because of the potential punishment, or is that like what goes into that?
I practice in federal court, but not as much as some people who exclusively did it. And so I'm probably not the best person to answer that. But I will tell you that the federal prosecutors and the federal investigative arm have a lot of resources, more than usually the state people or the county people. And so they can really put a lot of people on something if they want to fully investigate it. And usually that results in more incriminating evidence. But I'm not the best person to answer that. So that's just a guess on my part.
Got it.
And it's possible those numbers have changed.
And how did you arrive at this framework? I know we haven't gone into another part of your clientele yet, but I'm just curious, like, because the analogy I'll make, albeit flawed, is that I'll do interviews, right? Or I'll do work interviews, like hiring people for my team. And eventually, after a while, you start to generalize what's working, what's not. And you're like, hey, I should probably do this for everyone that I'm starting to interview. There's probably maybe there's a common question that gives me something that I need in terms of information. Like, is that a similar process for you? I'm just wondering, without being too much of a leading question, like, how did you arrive at your framework or process? I assume it's some combination of experience and other factors, right?
Well, first of all, I want to make it clear we haven't talked about how I represented how I talked to the appointed people, which was a little bit different. And so I do want to, I think
why don't we finish that part then, and then we can go back to this.
Because that maybe will partially answer your question. When I got appointed cases, when I got public cases, they didn't pay very well, but they were very interesting. The people who could afford an attorney got a lot of the similar charges, a lot of driving and drinking, a lot of domestic violence stuff. But the people who were appointed cases just had a variety of things, shoplifting, trespassing in parks, mail theft, just weird stuff that unfortunately was born out of indigency. So I appreciate that work because it always kept my skills sharp, because I wouldn't just do the same thing over and over again. But in regards to the framework, so by definition, those people didn't have the resources to hire their own attorney. Okay. Sometimes they were unhoused. or really living in the margins. Sometimes there was substance abuse, addiction issues, mental health issues, right? And so you did have to approach that in a different way. Sometimes they were very familiar with the court system. This might have been their 20th charge or 30th charge or something. And so explaining what an arraignment is or what a continuance is like, yeah, I know, I've been there. But what I found in those cases, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them, was that the people I was working with had a real distrust of institutions and the system. A lot of them were in foster care, and that didn't go well. And then, they were put out on the streets and they were looking for shelter, and that didn't go well. And they were looking for treatment, and that didn't go well. The police might have given them a bad time at times, that kind of thing. And so when I come in, I'm like another reflection of that. I'm not an employee of the county, but I'm paid by the county. And so there's a little bit of distrust there. And so a lot of my initial work is just explaining to them that I don't work for the prosecutor. I don't, even though they're paying my bills, I don't care. I don't want what they want. I'm only interested in them. And just, again, it's kind of this empowerment thing of like, even though the government may not have treated you well in your past, I'm going to be a change from that. I'm going to be somebody who's going to support you and advocate for you. And, you don't have to believe me now. You can like watch me in court and you can see me. And then I start arguing a lot to the judge and the prosecutors, and they get mad because I keep arguing. And then the clients are pretty happy about that because they see somebody's in their corner.
Mm-hmm.
So like, that was something I learned early on in the public defense about just how mistrustful those some of those defendants can be from their own life experiences, and just being aware of that, and then like addressing those issues head on.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the people who've never been in the system, I ask them like, what do you want to have happen in this case? And some of them say like, I don't want to go to jail. Okay, that's legitimate. I don't want to have a criminal record. Okay, that's legitimate. I don't want to go to trial. I really can't stand the idea of like people looking at me. I don't want to do public speaking. So please get a deal for me because I cannot go to trial. I cannot fathom that idea. Okay, that's fine. So, I start off by asking them what they want, and I, figure out why they want that thing. And that there's been a lot of common threads, what people care about. A lot of people are afraid of jail and things like that. And so that did help me like craft my initial explanations and scripts, because a lot of people had similar concerns. So I just wanted to like address them right off the bat.
Do these cases become kind of aggregated together over time, or are there some cases that still stand out to you, like either in some sort of shining way or in some sort of nightmarish way?
A lot of the cases have similar trends, but that's looking back with hindsight. When I'm in the moment, those are my people. That's all I'm thinking about. And then when the case is over, I'm moving on to something else. I do have cases that I think about, for one reason or another. Sometimes it's like something really unusual happened, or the facts leading to the cases were really unusual. I'm not going to go into them because I have to protect their privacy, but sometimes they stick with me.
Okay. So let's talk about the progression of your career in the sense of, I think we had talked before this interview, and I think it is important to talk about how judicial philosophy and certain experiences shape what you're doing now. So maybe you can elaborate a bit more on that, if that's possible.
Sure. So judicial philosophy is kind of funny to me because I've had this job for coming up on a year now. So it's like the idea that I have this like philosophy over the course of my decades of experience is just not the case. When I was an attorney, I took on these roles as a pro tem judge, and a pro tem is just Latin. It's a temporary thing. So when a regular judge was sick or at a conference or at a training or on vacation or something like that, they would get a temporary judge to step in. And so I started doing that in 2019, and I made the judges were happy with my work. And then once you get a reputation of doing okay with that, then other judges from other courts put you on their list, and then you get more calls, and it just cascades out. So I did a little bit in 2019, and then it kept growing and growing until in 2022 I recognized and I pursued trying to do this full time. Okay. So I'm not going to say I don't have any judicial experience, but like I will tell you my philosophies. I'm happy to answer that question, but I want to be like humble and recognize there's people who've been doing this for
Sure,
decades.
I
I'm not that
appreciate that.
person.
Yeah.
Um, so so we can talk about why originally I wanted to be a therapist. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. So my father, growing up, I didn't realize this until I like connected with it, but he was a very depressed person. Um, and I didn't find out till later there was a suicide attempt earlier. But there was a lot of time growing up where he was just kind of emotionally absent. And I think, I mean, I think we would say he's on the spectrum now. I don't think he's ever been tested, but I think there was some autism adjacency there too. So he was really poor about when I was growing up, like communicating well and communicating feelings and things. And so there was like this gap, in my knowledge. And so I really like I was aware of it. It's when you're a kid, you don't have anything to compare it to. But it was just like this, there's this absence of like this relationship, this like modeling behavior. Um, so there was this kind of craving that I had to like learn about people because I wasn't getting that at home. And so I would just I would talk to people. I would find situations where I could like go up to strangers and ask them questions. And I just like kept trying to learn more and more about people. Okay. And I think if I have one good trait is that I'm pretty good about like tucking things away. So if I learn some scrap of information, I could like store it. And, if I met somebody with a similar background, I'd be like, oh, I understand this about your background. Is that correct? And I'm like, yeah, that's really cool. You know that, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this is like this craving to like learn more about people. And then I had a very depressive episode like in high school, and I never got to like suicide attempts or anything like that, but I was just very unhappy in like my junior year, senior year. And then I went to my first year of college and I just dropped out because I just couldn't go to classes or anything like that, and just wasn't in the mind space for that. And so, this is all with like hindsight. Like I wasn't like diagnosing myself at the time, but again, I was like this craving of like, this isn't healthy. I don't like this. I need to learn like how to not to like be this way. But depression is like very insidious because it's this disease that it inhibits curing itself. You know what I mean? It's like it prevents you from getting better because you have this disease. And so, it took me some time to get there. And in the course of this, when I was very unhappy and like, I wouldn't say self-destructive because I think that has some specific connotations, but indifferent to my self-care, we could say. These people I knew were like, "Hey, we should do this scam. Do you want to be in?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure. I've got no reason not to because I've got no interest in anything and no regard for myself." And I'm not going to go into too many details again because other people were involved and there's a privacy. But I ended up getting arrested myself and charged with a crime, charged with a misdemeanor when I was much younger. And so this is where it gets kind of like connects up to the front here, right? Mm-hmm. So I get charged with a crime. I've got to go to court myself, and I go to my first appearance. And at your first appearance, you're supposed to have an attorney, and they're supposed to represent your interest, right? And the prosecutor comes up to me. I'm by myself. I don't have anybody, and he's like, "You know what? You don't need an attorney. You shouldn't have an attorney. You shouldn't have anybody. You can just plead guilty right now, get sentenced to a couple days in jail, and then you're done with this. Like, you're a smart kid. That's the right thing to do for you."
Wow.
And I'm a very dumb kid, and I'm like, I guess I don't know any better. Sure, this guy in a nice suit seems to work here.
That seems unethical for that person to say that.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And then the judge is like, "Okay, sounds good to me." So he signs off on it, and then I go to jail for 2 days, and I've got a criminal record now. And so that was really a radicalizing event, although I didn't realize that at the time. But so I, as a public defender, as a criminal defense attorney, it's amused me that this kind of miscarriage of justice. It's funny too because I was guilty. I was 100% guilty. They accused me of exactly what I did. They didn't overcharge it. They didn't lie or anything
Yeah.
like that. But the
But that's not the
process,
point, right? There needs to be a fair process. So,
yes, I agree with you. So yes, the process was bad. The outcome, a lot of people would say, was correct. And I think we're going to talk about that too. But so I have this criminal record, and that's like interfering with my ability to get jobs and get housing and things like that. And so I've got this very intimate knowledge of how the system works and how it affects people. And so I didn't know it at the time, and it wasn't until I went to law school and really worked in the public defenders that I realized like how bad this was, you know, because I just didn't know. It's like, okay, I guess this is what happens. Then you have to have some knowledge and some education, and then you realize, oh, this was really terrible. And so, you know, it's always amused me that like because they got that 2 days in jail from me, I've like taken away centuries of jail time from people I've represented. Like people who are looking at life in prison are not
mhm.
in life in prison. So like if they had been more fair in that, they would have had more net jail time. People don't think that way, but it's always amused me.
No, I mean, even as someone who doesn't know too much about it, as I said off the top, I just think that if I put myself in your shoes, there's something, maybe satisfying is not the word, but you're really bringing a value to society. Like you're really doing something that, quote unquote, makes a difference. And you're doing it on a large scale. It's like outside of yourself, right? It's not like I'm going back in time so that young Noah didn't get the 2 days, but it's in a criminal record for life or whatnot. You're helping everybody. It's the classic kind of, I don't even know if pay it forward is the right term, but just you're making an outsized impact on others based on your experience.
Well, I definitely take my experiences with me. And so, you know, I had this knowledge about mental health. What does, you know, depression lead to? What does that mean? How can we get him off this path? How can we get her off this path? And, you know, what does it look like when the process is not fair? So when you want to talk about my philosophies, I've got two like really important things. One is respect the dignity of the person in front of me, whether it's the attorneys, whether it's defendant, even court staff. You know, affirm their dignity, affirm their humanity. And the second is like bring confidence to the institution. Have people look at the courts and say, this is a fair place. I understand what's going on. It's fair. I might not agree with everything, but there's no question that, you know, this is a fair place. And I respect the court process for that.
Has that belief been firm for you? Has it been shaken at times? I mean, it's very typical for someone who's an outsider, again, to just say things like, this is rigged, the system is not working, or capitalism is evil, or whatever things that people like to generalize and say. But as someone who's inside that system, do you firmly believe that it is, I guess a better way to ask the question is it mostly working? Are there flaws with it? Like, how do you keep yourself going, through it all?
Um, are there flaws? Absolutely. And it's something that we as in, I think anybody who cares about the system talks about. I'm lucky that in the courthouse I work, there's 11 other judges. And so we regularly talk about ways to improve the process and make things fair. Everybody in that building is super dedicated to improving the process. There's a lot of structural issues, sometimes about resources. We can't, control what laws are passed. We can't control what police do, but it is something that speaking for Seattle Municipal Court, and I don't speak for Seattle Municipal Court, but I could say that I've worked with all those people there, and they all very much care about doing the right thing and, making the process as fair as possible. I will tell you, this is like what I was saying before about tucking things away. As an attorney, there were plenty of judges I was in front of who made rulings I didn't agree with, but they read everything, they asked good questions, and then they would make a decision that, well, I didn't agree with. I couldn't say that things weren't fair. I remember early on in my career, I got an appointed case, and I was like really, really raring to go. And, I was fighting like crazy. And I filed this motion to dismiss the case, and I felt really good about it. I always feel good about my stuff when I'm writing them. I'm like, oh yeah, this is really good. Oh yeah, this is a slam dunk, and I have a little more perspective now. But I was like telling my client, we're going to come to court, we're going to argue this, and hopefully the judge dismissed the case, and I think the law is on our side. And the judge was there, the prosecutor was there, we argued our positions. The judge clearly had read everything and asked good questions, and then she ruled against us and she explained why. And I was so mad that we had lost. I was just like apologizing. I'm like, I'm so sorry we lost, man. I was really, we lost the motion. And he's like, look, dude, you fought like hell. I read your stuff. It was really good. The judge clearly cared about doing the right thing. She read everything. You know, the scale wasn't weighted on one side or the other. Like I'm fine with the results here. It was like fair, and that was really informative to me about like what people in the system do want to see. Like for me, it was like if I don't win, it's bad. But they really did care about that process and about the appearance of fairness, and that stuck with me.
Mm-hmm.
But I can think of lots of examples of judges I've been in front of who weren't like that, who did do things that I thought were inappropriate or brought disrepute to the court. And so I tucked them away, and I'm just like, well, I'm not going to do those things. And then I'd see some judges who do things I was really appreciated and really respected, and I was like, I really like what that judge did. I'm going to tuck it away, and I'm going to use it for myself. I'm just going to steal it and make it part of my scripts or my work, and I do. So to answer your question, at all stages, nobody has the power to do everything. But as a judge, I have a little more authority to like run things in a certain way, and I try to run things in the way that as a lawyer I would have respected, and not run things in a way as a lawyer I would not have respected, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So let's get specific, because you've been sort of doing it on a temp basis since 2019, but what made you finally make that full-time transition? There must have been some key driver there.
Well, I started in 2019 because I had thought about it for myself, and I had thought about it for a while. And it had been something I had been aware of as a potential career path for a long time. It's funny because we think back and it's like when I was with my group of friends, I was the one listening to both sides and like giving an opinion. People would come and ask me that. And sometimes when my folks were fighting, I'd be like trying to mediate, which is not a great role for a child to be in. But I always did find myself in that position of like listening and helping people like get to a resolution in their disputes. So there was like that initial genetic inherentness about it. And I was thinking about it, and I really did find judges fascinating. I don't know why. I was raised Jewish, and there was a lot of emphasis on education in the congregation we were in about like the wisdom of leaders and things like that, and that always stuck with me. I don't know why. I did a semester in Anchorage, and I was working for a firm there, but I had some time off one time, so I just went down to the courthouse, and I was watching some proceedings. And then when it was over, the judge was like, "Hey, who are you?" And I told him I'm a law student and I'm visiting. And he's like, "Oh, what kind of work do you do?" And I'm like, "I'm thinking about alternative dispute resolution, judicial stuff maybe." And he's like, "Well, you're a law student. You shouldn't be thinking about being a judge." And I'm like, "No, I'm going to think about it anyway. But thanks for the tip."
Wait, what was his reason for saying you shouldn't think about it? Because it's so far into the future, or something else?
Probably because it was pretentious for a law student to think they could ever be a judge. Like you just don't have the years of experience or the wisdom or something. I don't know. When I started my own practice, I met with a woman who had her own firm, and I was starting things like a year or 9 months or something out of law school. The way things worked out, like right after the public defender position ended, I was like, I'm not going to just wait around for the phone to ring. I just want to get started. And I met with her over coffee, and I wanted her to like give me some advice about, setting up a corporation and business addresses and all that stuff. And she was like, "Oh, you're far too young. You can't start a firm right out of law school. Like you got to work places and you got to learn stuff before you can do that yourself." I'm like, "Well, this was pointless, but thanks for the advice." And I just ignored that and kept doing what I was doing. So it happens. People are like, "You can't do this. You're too young. You don't have the experience." And you can listen or not. I chose not to. But I think that the judge, it's a position of regard, and I acknowledge that. But I don't think it's a problem for people to think about where they want to be eventually and work towards getting that at any point.
That whole notion of thinking big and far into the future, where do you think that comes from?
Um, I don't know. I can't say. I can say there was a period of my life where I really wasn't thinking beyond day to day, and I wasn't my happiest time, and so I try not to go back to that spot. I've really learned for myself, for my own mental health, that being externally focused, thinking about other people, thinking about how to make things better for other people is really positive for myself too. I mean, maybe that's selfish, but being just by myself with my own thoughts, with nothing to like look forward to or aspire to or something, is not good for my own mental health, and so I try to avoid that.
Right. So when you're, yeah, because you can get too, I would not consider what I've been through myself depression, but it's like when you get into this constant feedback loop where you're creating a lot of anxiety on yourself when you just start to, that's when things get difficult. So maybe going outside of yourself or going longer term um, potentially are helpful tools, right? Or approaches.
Well, and these people were really silly because my whole thing all my life has just been I talk to people. If I have
Right.
questions, I just find somebody who knows that stuff and I talk to them. And so for them to say like, "Don't talk to me about this because you're not ready," it's like that's not who I am. You know,
Hmm.
whether I
Hmm.
succeed or not, that's one thing. But I'm always going to talk to people who know more and try to learn from them.
Hmm. Hmm. Very much a non sequitur, but you remind me of an author in a book that I read, and it's one of my favorite books. And for some weird reason, the author's name doesn't come to mind right now. Basically, he wrote this. I think it was a really wonderful
What a
book where
great
he,
story, James. I remind you of a
yeah,
book. I don't remember the name. I don't remember the author. It might not have been a book. It might have been a dream. But anyway,
it might have come in a fever dream, but basically, he was just writing about uh, doing profiles on people, right? He interviews people. It's about like how they find the meaning in their life and career. And you strike me as that author who is able to just relate to a lot of people and just talk to all kinds of folks from all walks of life and just get them to like, I can just imagine you as like the man on the street, just approaching somebody with no trepidation or fear, just you're willing. It's not even like an introverted extroverted thing. It's just like you just have a willingness to talk to people. That's the feeling that I'm getting. Like you could have written that book,
sure. But, James, people like to talk about themselves. So it's
that
not
is
like you
true.
have to twist anyone's arm if you're like, tell me about yourself. And they're like, oh boy, buckle up.
I've
I
been
got a lot
waiting
to
for
tell
this
you.
question, yeah, or
Yeah, I
this
work in a
topic,
box
yeah.
factory. Yeah. You want to hear about
Yeah.
boxes? There's things, but people are appreciate like their individual experiences being acknowledged and all that. You asked for an example of like bad judging.
Hmm.
Is that what you said earlier?
Yes.
There's there are things that I will there's things I definitely won't do and things I probably won't do in the courtroom that I've experienced, right? That I'm like, this is not the kind of judge I want to be. And so like an easy example I give is I was with a client one time in front of a judge, and my client's name wasn't phonetically pronounced in the right way. Like the spelling wasn't right. I don't remember their name, and I wouldn't say it anyway. But and my name is Weil, but people see it, they see Wheel or Wiley or something. And so, I was introducing myself to the judge. I'm like, Your Honor, I'm Noah Weil, and this is my client, whatever. And he just couldn't get it right. And he had a name that you could not mispronounce the way it was spelled. It looked exactly like it is pronounced, and it's just
Hmm.
impossible to mispronounce it.
Hmm.
And so, explain it. And he's like, close enough. And then he just moved on. And he just did not care about getting the names right. And God knows my name has been mispronounced all my life, and I'm used to it. But people's names are important to them. There's a
Sure.
lot of identity tied into that. And even people with nothing, they have their name, right? It might be a family name or it might have some personal significance.
Hmm.
And so to like disregard that, to not care to get it right, I thought was like really reflected poorly on him. And so
Hmm.
I've certainly in court, I want to get it right, and I'll say, "Am I pronouncing that correctly?" And they'll tell me if I am or not, and I'll try to get it right. And there's been some names that I have not been able to pronounce correctly, just names that for whatever reason could get right. And I always say I apologize. I'm not able to pronounce it correctly, but I recognize, I'm
Acknowledging,
not.
sure.
Yeah, and it's just like a little thing you can do just to recognize their individualness. their own
Mm-hmm.
humanity. And the
Mm-hmm.
fact that this judge, who clearly in his life had never experienced people mispronouncing his name, just didn't have that kind of empathy. I just thought that was really disappointing.
Yeah.
I've had judges yell at me like a lot, and I don't mind it. I mean, I have kids now, so I'm used to being yelled at anyway. But
Or
I'd much
yelling
rather.
too, right? But not yelled at. Oh,
But
I
now
guess kids too.
I would much rather have judges yell at me than my clients. I can
Mm-hmm.
handle it. Like, I'm not really worried for myself. But I feel like judges yelling is usually a loss of control over the courtroom or your own
Yeah,
emotions.
loss of emotional or self-control, right?
Yeah. Or, they want to protect the dignity of things. Just something. I don't think it's a good look. I can't say I would never do it. I did it one time, not as a lawyer, but a very unique situation that I feel like was appropriate. But like, I've seen judges where it was in front of multiple times, like yelling at me, yelling at other lawyers, yelling at defendants. It's just like their MO. They just want to
Mm-hmm.
instill fear in people or something. And I don't buy that. I don't think it reflects well in the courts.
This is it's something I think about. Like when I do what I do, which is I do things in software, I build things. None of what I do is really truly affecting the livelihood of people. Like, sure, maybe I make a wrong decision and this thing has a bug or it launches a week late. That's not the way I see it. It's not life or death stuff. The world goes on. But I just think that what you described, which is what goes on in the court, it really is someone's future. Like making a decision or communicating a certain way, or even things like upholding the dignity of a person, like their name. That it's got a much more profound effect. And I the way you describe it, it makes me feel like folks in these functions, whether they're judges or attorneys, they need to be held to some sort of standard. Like it's really rough if just because that person has a bad day, everyone has a bad day because we're human, that could, like, you making the wrong decision or not really making the best decision that day could really impact someone profoundly. That goes way beyond like, oh, I screwed up at my office job. So I don't know, like is there some sort of higher standard? Is there some sort of screening process that tries to ensure that these mistakes don't happen, or they don't happen 80% of the time?
So there's a lot to unpack there, James.
Yeah, sorry, that was a really, really long question. So
I
yeah,
think I'm hearing your midlife crisis now, and I appreciate you
a
sharing
little
that with
bit,
me.
little bit.
That's fine. That's fine.
Sorry.
So I'm going to try to circle around, really make it confusing for your listeners, your listener. I'm not
That's the way
really
to
sure
go.
how
Yeah.
popular your podcast is, but I'm going to try to kind of come at that from a few different angles. So for me, I'm happy to be helping people. I'm happy to be using my life experiences and where I was on the wrong path, and then I learned and I course corrected, and I've got a good relationship with my father now, and I feel like those lessons make me a better father and all that stuff. I'm happy to have that experience. When I was younger, I wasn't happy, and that wasn't good for me. It wasn't good for other people. We talked about Magic. I played Magic then, and I think some people weren't happy with the way I conducted myself there. I was an extremely good player, world class, but it doesn't mean like I was approaching things in a healthy way. And I know some people still have raw feelings about that. I think that the idea that I'm a judicial officer now would probably greatly offend them. But there's this quote. It's not quite the right quote, but it's the sentiment from Muhammad Ali, and it really stuck with me. And it's basically, show me a person who's the same at 50 as they were at 20, and I'll show you somebody who's wasted 30 years of their life. And I really like this quote, not only because it underscores the idea that people can change, but it emphasizes people should change, people should improve, people should get on that path. And I've really tried to live that and do better than I was back then, and use what I've learned and experienced to help other people get on their right path eventually. And so So for you, James, I would say you have this experience, you've had this education, you're doing this work right now. You don't have to continue doing this. You can take what you've learned and shift it somewhere else. Obviously, you're getting some value, some benefit of this podcast, this interview. You're interviewing a lot of interesting people. I've listened to some of them, and so you don't feel inhibited from continuing that work if you feel like that's good for your own mental health. As I said before, the work I'm doing, I'm happy to take those lessons, but also selfishly, I'm a happier person and I'm a better person because I'm doing this external work, that fits for me. So, I just feel like nothing is set in stone, and you can guide people and people can make changes to better themselves. You asked about how to prevent people, judges or lawyers, from having a bad day from screwing people over. Was that the essence of it?
That was the question, yeah.
Well, there's a number of things. So I'll acknowledge that judges have a lot of power and a lot of power to mess up lives, and lawyers have a lot of power and a lot of power to mess up lives. And so, yeah, that's a concern. It's a valid concern. I feel like it doesn't happen all that often because there are some checks in the system, but at the same time, if you want to do a Google search of judges making big mistakes, I'm sure you'll find something without looking too hard. I subscribe to this quarterly newsletter of judicial ethics situations from all around the country because I don't want to make a judicial ethic mistake. And yeah, there's some judges who have made some really terrible decisions. They might have lost their jobs, got reprimanded, that kind of thing. So there's consequences if it goes really out of hand. But yeah, there's decades and decades of judges making bad decisions and messing things up for people. Yeah, that's a risk. So to become a lawyer, which in Washington state, all judges have to be lawyers first. I think that's true for most states, but not necessarily all of them, depending on the work. But anyway, so to become a lawyer, you've got to have an undergraduate degree. You got to go to law school. You have to pass a character and fitness exam. You have to pass an ethics part of the bar exam, the written test. And as you can imagine, I had to do a little bit more in my character and fitness because I had my own, criminal conviction. So that was an extra layer of conversation. I had somebody help me with that. So they really try to not get people in the system in the first place that look like it could be a problem. That has cut both ways. We have a representative right now, a state representative who was a lawyer, and she had her own felony drug. She's been very upfront about this, but she had some felony drug convictions, and they didn't want her to become a lawyer. They said it was too much. And she went to our Washington Supreme Court, and they unanimously reversed that board's decision and said, she had clearly reformed herself and made amends, and we need people with life experiences in the system. And she became a great lawyer, and now she's a representative in our state legislature, and she shares her story regularly. Maybe a good guest for you. She's a really interesting woman. But
that does sound like an interesting person. Yes. Talk about second chances, right? And turning things around proverbially, right? Yeah.
But also, a lot of her work is, in the legislature about criminal justice issues because she has some firsthand knowledge. It's not just an academic exercise for her. She has those life experiences, and that is valuable. So there's a tension there between, cookie cutter people, all lots of privilege and no life struggles, becoming lawyers, and then that's kind of having this ivory tower look of things. Like, how could anyone ever commit a crime? Like, I would never commit a crime. I don't need to steal a loaf of bread. Why would anybody steal a loaf of bread? Right? But also people who have, defrauded folks and, done domestic violence and things like that. Maybe they shouldn't be lawyers. Maybe they don't quite have the moral backbone to take on those responsibilities. So
yeah.
I will tell you there's checks. Obviously, we've had people that have gone through and have not done well. The job is pretty stressful. So sometimes people who are perfectly fine moral character in the beginning, the stress starts getting at them. Then they start turning to alcohol or drugs or trying to fund a lifestyle. That's problematic. And that's, I think, a failing in our system that we don't have enough support for attorneys, in my opinion. I think I'm allowed to say that. As a judge, there's a lot of things I'm not allowed to say. You kind of give up your First
But
Amendment
that's
right.
one of the things you could say. Sure. Yeah.
I hope so, but I'm saying it anyway. I think attorneys should be more supported in their mental health in everywhere. We have a discipline system. If an attorney is doing something unethical or gets charged with a crime, we have a discipline system. Just because they're accused of something doesn't mean there is going to be discipline. A lot of our lawyer discipline results in kind of an agreement where they take classes or they get monitored for a while, then there's nothing public, which I think is fine for the right situation. I remember a story of somebody who was a criminal defense attorney in Washington, and he had completely burned out, 100%. He was done, and he had active cases, and he just left, and he opened up a bar on the other side of the state. And these clients were like, my lawyer is gone, I can't get a hold of him. And then some reporters tracked him down, and he was like, I'm done. And they're like, you're going to lose your license. You're not going to be allowed to be a lawyer anymore. He's like, great. I do not want to be a lawyer anymore. That is the goal. I want to run this bar, and that is the life I want now. And so that's like an extreme version.
Yeah.
But those, going to the question of protections, those clients he had probably didn't end up too bad. They probably found other lawyers for them, and they, no judge is going to throw the book at them while their lawyer, abandoned ship, right? So even though that lawyer I don't agree with him completely abandoning all his cases and moving across the state, I don't think ultimately that's going to make his clients suffer too much, right? So even if a lawyer does do something improper, that doesn't mean it's going to be a disaster for somebody. If a lawyer misses something in courts, there's appeals processes. It's better to not have to appeal. It's better to win at the trial level, but there are higher courts who can look at the trial record and look at what happened and then decide if a defendant was not represented correctly or there's some other structural issues. If a judge makes a big mistake in the law, again, the appeals court can say a mistake was made here. We need to reverse this and we need to try again without this mistake happening.
How to test for empathy. That feels like an important thing in these types of roles, doesn't it?
How to test for empathy?
Yeah, how does one... I mean, to me, this is just my take, but it feels like one has to be pretty strong empathy for others to be effective, no? Or maybe it doesn't matter in that the process is in checks.
I'm trying to think about that. What you do have to understand, James, is that assuming the system is working correctly, there are lawyers on both sides. Okay. And so they're there advocating for their positions and they're explaining why they want something to happen.
Right. Interests are represented in both ways. Yeah.
Yeah. So, the judge doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. I personally, and I think a lot of good judges will, ask for a basis. You're asking for this person to have bail. You want $5,000 bail. Tell me why. Why is that the right ruling of the court? You don't want me to put bail on this person. Tell me why. Why should that be the ruling of the court? And then both sides can give their positions, and then you can weigh them and look at the relevant law and look at the relevant court rules and things, then make a decision. But you don't have to invent everything. You've got advocates there who have positions. They will tell you what they want the court to do, and they'll tell you why. Ideally, they'll tell you why, and then you make a decision from that.
Fair enough. What's the long game for you as a judge? Like, how do you see your career, in the next perhaps 3 to 5 years?
So you'd asked about like a full-time judge thing, and it's not like those positions grow on trees. There are geographical restrictions, where you can be and things like that. And so an opening in a courthouse near me that I was eligible for opened up, and I went for it last year. The judge there had moved to a different court, and so there was a vacancy. And so the county council was soliciting applications from qualified people, and then they would pick somebody to be appointed to take that vacancy. And I went for that, and it was a really interesting process, really intense. I never got anything through like that before. It was like kind of like running for election, but it was just the electorate was 9 people. But I had to get rated, and I had to get letters of support, and it wasn't fundraising, but there was a lot of like groundwork to put together a
A
package.
lot of self-campaigning, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, I probably put like 100 hours into it from start to finish, and it was really intense. And I didn't get that position, and I did, and it was disappointing. But I also feel like, well, I worked really hard for it, and I'm glad I had this experience and I learned from it, and I don't feel like I, half-assed it, if I can say it. But at the same time, as that position was open, the Seattle Municipal Court was hiring for a magistrate position. And so while I didn't get that vacancy that I went for, I did get the other judicial position that I went for, which was this one with Seattle Municipal Court. And so I'm coming up on a year there. I'm very happy. I have a lot of respect for the work of the court and the people there. To my knowledge, I mean, I guess if I was working really hard at it, I could try to find some judicial opening somewhere, but I'm perfectly comfortable where I am right now. I'm not in any hurry to leave. I don't think I'll stay here forever. I don't think anyone expects me to stay there forever. A lot of people don't, but right now I'm perfectly comfortable not having to go through that 100-hour process again, and just continue the work I'm doing at the court, and learning from people and trying to help out. I should explain, because I don't think anyone understands this. I'm a magistrate judge, and so what that means is, in Washington State, every judge position is elected. Like the judicial seats created by the legislature, they're elected positions. But sometimes there's more work for those just elected positions. So the courts will hire somebody. Sometimes they call them commissioners, sometimes they call them magistrates. And so they're full-time judicial officers, but they're hired instead of elected to do the overflow work. And that's what I am. I'm a hired judge from the court because there's more cases than they can do. And so there's not much distinction in the courtroom, but
the work is the same, right?
The work is the same. I'm assigned based on my supervisor, which is the presiding judge of the building. Mm-hmm. And they have hiring and firing power. So if they don't like my work, they can fire me. If people don't like an elected judge's work, it's basically elect somebody else in the next election, but you can't. There's no one to fire. Mm-hmm. So that's the big difference. But,
understood.
But the work is similar.
Are you finding that you have the right balance in your life in terms of the work and the stuff outside it?
I think so. I don't know. I think so. I'm trying. I have some friends that are judges who are working really long hours. A couple friends of mine got new positions as judges, and they are figuring out how that works, and they're working very long hours, like leaving before their kids are awake and coming home after their kids are asleep. And that's not the case. And that's not the case for me right now. And that's what I said before. Like I could look for something like that, but that's not really what I want to do when my kids are as young as they are. And so I'm pretty comfortable with the work I'm doing. Like, Seattle Municipal Court is the busiest court of limited jurisdiction in the state of Washington. It is really busy. And so being a part of that and like helping out and figuring out ways to make the system more fair and more efficient and things like that, like that's exciting work. So I'm perfectly satisfied in my job, and while the commute's annoying, like I do usually get to see the kids before I have to leave, and I definitely have dinner with them, and so I'm perfectly happy on that front.
That's good to hear. And how do you manage stress?
I would say probably exercise is my best way. It's sometimes hard to find the time, especially right now with the season. It's very cold and dark here. And so I like to run in the spring and the summer, but it's not fun at all for me to run in the dark and the rain. So I go to the gym when I can. Being a judge can be kind of isolating sometimes. When you're a lawyer, especially a defense lawyer, it's really this underdog position, because criminal defense lawyers lose more than they win. I mean, it depends how you define winning and losing, but usually the government with the resources, they win more often than not. And so there's a lot of camaraderie among the criminal defense bar about us versus them, and oh, the prosecutors are fighting dirty, or the judges know what he or she is doing. And you have that like support. You can go to events together and things like that. And as a judge, there's really nothing like that. There are events, but you can't say the system's not fair because you're the system. So you don't like it, you better do something about it. But the lawyers I used to hang out with, sometimes I see them and it's cordial and everything, but it's not the same. There's a
Right.
lot of like community building before court started when everybody's gathering outside and talking about their cases and things like that. And it's just, there's nothing like that right
Hmm.
now. And it's something you miss. And I fully was aware of that. And it was already happening when I was a temporary judge a little bit. So it's
Hmm.
not like this was a shock to me. But I do try to see peers. I do try to see friends and things when I can, because I think it humanizes you. And I think you really don't want to live like in an ivory tower, because I think when a judge loses their humanity, that's not good for anybody else.
Right. Yeah. That sense of community, man, it's so critical to cultivate whichever communities you're a part of. Yeah. If you just speak from personal experience, like if you ditch some of that, it comes back to in a negative way sometimes. But that's that's a whole nother podcast. Yeah.
I check in with myself. Depression is not something you're cured from. So it's sometimes I feel it, like I can feel it like rearing up, and I've reached a level of awareness and maturity where I can be aware of that and not like sink into it. It's like, oh, I know what's going on. My neurotransmitters are not going the way they should right now, and I need to be aware of that and take active steps, and it's fine. And so, like, if I was starting to get really stressed out or about something, I feel like I wouldn't be caught off guard, right? So I could hopefully head it off at the pass. But so far I've been galvanized by the work, and I like the work I'm doing. So it hasn't been an issue.
Hmm. Is there anything that you tell your younger self from perhaps 5 or 10 years ago?
Well, I would say, I could go back 20 plus years and say, don't do that crime, dude. That's not going to go well for you. Although I will say also that it really gave me a lot of education and a lot of like the work I do. I am so protective of defendants' rights now. When I have a guilty plea in front of me, I'm just like, hey, I got this document that says you want to plead guilty. Is that right? Do you actually want to plead guilty? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, let's go over this like line by line. I want to make sure at every step of the way, this is what you want to do, and you understand what this means and what you're giving up and what I can do. And so I hope I would be the same way, but you don't know. But having the experience that I had, I am now, I do not want anyone to feel railroaded. Like I will tell them, like, anytime you want to take a break, you want to talk to your lawyer about something, you got all the time in the world. Go for it. That's fine. You don't feel rushed. One time there was a person I was like, is this what you want to do? He's like, no, I don't want to do this. My lawyer's making me. I'm innocent. I'm like, well, we're not going to plead you guilty today, buddy. Get out of here. And
Hmm.
it was embarrassing for the lawyer, but I'm not going to do that. Period. And so, I can tell this. I can tell this older self of me, this or younger self, um, here's something to do differently. But I think it's more valuable to just say, I've had this experience. Now, how can I use this experience to like do better now? I can't change the past, but I can utilize it to make a better present.
Yeah. Like you said, there's certain Magic players back in the day that formed a negative impression of you. Maybe some of it is warranted, some of it is not, but there's no way you can change that. So, there's no time
I
machine.
will say,
So you
like,
gotta keep going, keep trucking, right?
I am perfectly at ease with my past and my life, and I am sorry for any damage I've done. I don't feel guilt because it all led to this point where now I can hopefully help people and do better for society. So if that was the cost, so be it. It wasn't my intention, but I'm trying to make the most of it at this point.
All right. Well, Noah Weil, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me. And yeah, any last things you want to say, or any, I don't know if you want to give any shout outs or any plugs? Maybe this is not the kind of episode for that, but I don't
Let's
know.
see. Shout outs to
Any
Justice.
closing statements? I don't know.
Shout out to the Constitution. I love that document to pieces.
Yeah.
It's just the
Yeah.
best.
It's well made. Yeah.
I will say that judges are people. They come with life experiences. Lawyers are people. And recognizing that everybody's a person, everybody has their life experiences, I think helps. I think you can stave off the rough edges. If somebody has a bad interaction, you can think about looking beyond that and why. If there's somebody that does something you really respect, you can steal it. You can make it part of your own life philosophy. You can make it part of your own actions. Like, everybody has something to offer and nobody is perfect. So everyone's just a person.
All right. Appreciate the sharing and wish you all the best, my friend.
Thanks, James. It was a pleasure. Have a good night.
Thanks for listening to The Why with James Hsu. To support the show, please leave a rating on your favorite podcasting app, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any platform really. It helps spread the word and tell others that you enjoy my work. Same goes for YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe and leave a comment. That helps get the word out and goes a long way. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.